I've always been obsessed with places forgotten by time. There's something beautifully tragic about nature reclaiming what we leave behind. But after what happened last October, I haven't stepped foot in a forest, and I don't think I ever will again. What I'm about to tell you is exactly why some places are abandoned for a reason. My target was a place called Oakhaven, a 1920s mining town tucked deep into the dense, suffocating wilderness of the Appalachian Mountains. It's not on any modern map. The only way to find it is to follow an old, overgrown logging road for about 14 miles on foot. It's the kind of isolation where if you break an ankle, you're just dead. Nobody is coming to look for you. The canopy overhead was so thick that even at noon, the forest floor was cast in a sickly gray twilight. The air smelled of wet earth, rotting pine needles, and that sharp, metallic tang of an approaching storm. By the time I reached the outskirts of Oakhaven, my legs were burning and my pack felt like it was filled with lead. But seeing the town was a rush. Through the creeping fog, the silhouettes of about a dozen collapsing wooden structures bled into view. Rotted cabins with caved-in roofs leaned against each other like crooked teeth. An old rusted sorting facility loomed at the back of the valley, swallowed entirely by aggressive ivy. The silence was absolute. No birds, no wind, just the heavy, damp quiet of a graveyard. I pulled out my camera and started recording, stepping carefully over the decaying porch of the first cabin. The door was long gone, the hinges rusted away to nothing. Inside, the floorboards were spongy and coated in a thick layer of green moss. I expected to find old tin cans, maybe some rusted tools or an old bed frame. What I found instead made my stomach drop into my boots. In the center of the cramped room, the moss had been scraped away, exposing the bare, rotting wood. Sitting right in the middle of that clearing was a fire pit. And I don't mean a circle of rocks from some teenagers camping 10 years ago. I mean a neatly constructed ring of stones containing a pile of ash. I knelt, pulling off my glove, and hovered my hand over the gray flakes. Heat radiated against my palm. The embers were still glowing orange underneath the surface. Someone was here. Recently, like within the last hour. My heart started hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I stood up, backing away slowly toward the empty doorway. As my eyes adjusted to the shadows in the corners of the room, I noticed something hanging from the ceiling beams. It was wrapped in dirty brown burlap and tied with thick twine. It was the size of a large dog, and a thick, dark liquid was slowly dripping from the bottom of the sack, pooling onto the moss with a sickening plop, plop, plop. The smell hit me then. Copper and spoiled meat. I turned to bolt out the door, desperate to get back to the trail, but as I stepped onto the rotting porch, I froze. Standing about 50 yards away, perfectly still among the fog and the dead trees, was a tall, unnaturally thin figure wrapped in tattered, muddy clothes. It wasn't looking at me, it was facing the woods, but as I stood there, paralyzed by a primal, suffocating terror, the figure slowly raised its arm, pointing a long, pale finger directly at the path I had just used to hike in. And then, from the shadows inside the cabin directly behind me, a hoarse voice whispered my name. I didn't turn around. Every primal instinct screaming in my brain told me that if I looked back into the suffocating gloom of that cabin, I was going to die. The whisper hadn't been a trick of the wind. It was a wet, rattling sound, laced with a grotesque familiarity. My name. How in God's name did it know my name? I didn't wait to find out. I launched myself off the rotting porch, my boots slamming into the mud, and sprinted blindly toward the tree line. The damp air tore at my throat. I risked one terrified, jarring glance over my shoulder as I ran. The tall, muddy figure that had been standing in the fog pointing at the trail, gone, swallowed entirely by the thick, rolling gray mist. There were no retreating footsteps, no rustling of bushes, just an empty space where that nightmare had stood seconds before. I ran until the burning in my legs and lungs forced me to collapse. I threw myself behind the rusted, hollowed-out husk of an old boiler tank on the edge of the mining settlement. I pressed my back against the freezing metal, gasping for air, violently clamping both hands over my mouth to muffle the sound of my own ragged breathing. The heavy, unnatural silence of Oakhaven returned, pressing down on me like a physical weight. I strained to listen. Crunch. A dry branch snapped somewhere in the fog. Crunch. Drag. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, dragging through the dead leaves. They weren't frantic, they were methodical. Whatever was out there was pacing the perimeter of the collapsing buildings, hunting for where I had bolted. Panic is a funny thing. It can freeze you, or it can give you absolute tunnel vision clarity. My clarity told me one thing. I had to get back to the overgrown logging road. That 14-mile hike was my only lifeline out of this hellhole. Keeping low, I crawled on my hands and knees through the wet ferns. My clothes were soaked, chilling me to the bone, but I didn't care. The metallic tang in the air grew stronger, mixing again with that sickening odor of spoiled meat I'd smelled back in the cabin. I navigated by the tree line, finally reaching the narrow gap between the ridges that served as the entrance to the valley. But as I broke through the thick underbrush and stood up, my stomach completely hollowed out. The trail. It was blocked. And I don't mean blocked by a random fallen branch. Several massive dead pines had been deliberately felled and dragged across the pathway, their jagged branches interlocking to form an impenetrable 10-foot-high wall of dead wood. The sheer physical strength required to move these logs was staggering. This wasn't just a barricade, it was a locked door. The figure hadn't been pointing at the trail to tell me to leave, it was mocking me. I scrambled up to the barricade, my bare hands tearing on the rough bark as I desperately looked for a gap to squeeze through or a foothold to climb over. That's when my fingers brushed against something cold and smooth. Tacked to the center of the largest log with a rusted, square-headed mining nail was a piece of paper sealed inside a small plastic Ziploc bag to protect it from the dampness. I pulled out my flashlight, my hands trembling so violently the beam danced wildly across the wood. I clicked it on and aimed it at the plastic. It was a photograph, a glossy Polaroid, but it wasn't old and it wasn't of the town. It was a picture of me. I was asleep in the back of my SUV. A picture clearly taken through the rear window of my car at the trailhead, 14 miles away, before I had even started the hike this morning. And written in jagged, dark red ink across the white border at the bottom were 3 words. I stared at those 3 jagged words scrawled in dark red ink across the bottom of the Polaroid. Now you stay. My brain misfired. I felt that cold, sickening rush of adrenaline dump into my bloodstream, making my hands shake so hard I almost dropped the flashlight. The implication was infinitely worse than the message itself. This thing, this person, had watched me sleeping in my SUV at the trailhead. It had followed me. It stalked me in complete silence for 14 miles through untouched wilderness, waited for me to wander into the settlement, and then silently built a barricade that would take a crew of men to assemble. I was being hunted for sport. I shoved the Polaroid into my jacket pocket and grabbed a thick, jutting branch on the barricade, desperately hauling myself upward. I had to get over it. But as I pulled my weight up, a sharp, searing pain sliced across my palm. I hissed, dropping back into the wet dirt. I shined my light on the wood. Tangled within the dead branches, rusted and practically invisible in the gloom, was razor wire. It was wrapped meticulously through the logs, turning the barricade into a meat grinder. There was no climbing over it. The sky above the canopy was rapidly shifting from gray to a bruised, deepening purple. Night was falling fast. If I stayed trapped in this clearing when it got pitch black, I was a sitting duck. My only option was to bypass the trail entirely. I had to go off-road, bushwhacking straight through the dense, unforgiving woods to flank the barricade and eventually reconnect with the path a mile or 2 down. I plunged into the tree line to my left.
Instantly, the forest swallowed me. The undergrowth here was violently thick. Briars tore at my jeans, and unseen roots twisted around my ankles like skeletal fingers. The fog clung to the ground, hiding the uneven terrain, making every step a dangerous gamble. I kept my flashlight off, terrified the beam would act as a beacon. I relied only on the ambient, fading twilight, navigating by the dark, towering silhouettes of the ancient pines. After about 20 minutes of agonizingly slow progress, my boot caught on something soft but heavy. I pitched forward, landing hard in the wet dirt. I bit back a curse, rolling over to see what had tripped me. It wasn't a root. It was a faded blue hiking backpack, half buried in the mud and moss. Against my better judgment, I clicked on my flashlight, shielding the lens with my fingers to keep the beam narrow. The backpack was old, the fabric brittle and caked in dirt. I unzipped the main compartment. Inside was a heavy sleeping bag, a rusted camping stove, and a small, heavy zip-up pouch. I opened the pouch. A dozen driver's licenses spilled out into the mud. They belonged to men and women of all ages. Some expired in 2015, some in 2008, one, incredibly, from 1996. Alongside the IDs was a tangled clump of car keys on various keychains. My breath hitched in my throat as I panned the flashlight around the immediate area. The blue backpack wasn't alone. Hidden beneath the ferns and rotting logs were shoes, dozens of them, hiking boots, sneakers, mostly singles, covered in layers of dead leaves and grime. This wasn't just a detour. I had stumbled into a graveyard of lost hikers, a trophy room. I was still kneeling in the dirt, paralyzed by the scale of the horror I'd just uncovered, when the silence of the woods was broken. Creak? It wasn't the sound of a footstep on the ground. It came from directly above my head. I slowly aimed my flashlight up into the dense, intertwining branches of the massive pine tree towering over me. Hanging upside down from a thick limb, suspended by its knees like a giant, grotesque bat, was the tall, muddy figure. Its elongated arms dangled toward me, and from beneath its tattered hood, a perfectly round, pale, and entirely featureless mask stared down at me. Then its neck snapped sideways with a loud, sickening crack, and it dropped from the branch.
The thud of its body hitting the forest floor was sickeningly heavy. It didn't land on its feet like a person. It hit the ground on all fours, its long, mud-caked limbs splayed out like a massive, deformed spider. I didn't scream. My throat seized up completely, paralyzed by a rush of pure, undiluted terror. I scrambled backward, my boots kicking up clumps of wet earth and decaying leaves, desperately trying to put distance between me and that pale, featureless face. As I stumbled upright, the creature let out a sound I will never, ever forget. It wasn't a roar or a growl, it was a wet, sputtering giggle, like a child trying to laugh with a throat full of fluid. I turned and ran. I abandoned all caution, sprinting blindly into the pitch-black woods. Branches whipped across my face, slicing my cheeks. Unseen briars tore at my clothes. Every step was a dangerous gamble in the dark, but I didn't dare turn on my flashlight. I could hear it behind me. It wasn't running, it was crashing through the undergrowth, its movements erratic and explosive. Snap, thud, rustle, snap. It sounded huge, heavy, and impossibly fast. My lungs burned like I was breathing battery acid. The metallic smell of the approaching storm was entirely overpowered by the stench of the creature, that horrible, suffocating cocktail of copper and rotting meat. I realized with mounting despair that heading further into the deep woods was a death sentence. The trees were too dense, the ground too uneven. I was going to break an ankle, and then I was going to end up as another ID card in that faded blue backpack. My only chance was to loop back toward the abandoned buildings. Maybe I could find a structure with a solid door, a basement, a heavy lock, anywhere to break its line of sight. I banked hard to my right, using the faint gray illumination of the town's clearing as a beacon through the trees. The crashing behind me abruptly paused.
For a terrifying second, there was dead silence. Then, a sharp, piercing whistle echoed through the canopy, mimicking the exact tone of a lost hiker calling for help. It was playing with me. I broke through the tree line, stumbling back into the decaying ruins of Oakhaven. The fog had thickened into a physical wall, rolling through the dilapidated cabins like a living thing. At the far end of the valley, the massive, rusted iron structure of the ore sorting facility loomed. It was a hulking silhouette against the darkening sky, made of corrugated metal and heavy timber, infinitely sturdier than the rotting wooden shacks. I sprinted across the open ground, my boots splashing heavily through deep puddles of icy water. The heavy metal door of the facility was rusted, partially open, wedged deep into the mud. I squeezed through the narrow gap, the rusted metal tearing at my jacket, and forced my entire weight against the inside to push it shut. The hinges screamed a deafening metallic protest, but the door scraped across the concrete floor and slammed into the frame. I stood in the pitch-black darkness of the facility, heart pounding so hard my ribs ached, and listened. Outside, the heavy, dragging footsteps approached the metal door. Then they stopped. Silence. I held my breath, gripping my heavy metal flashlight like a club. Minutes ticked by. No banging, no scratching, just the faint sound of rain finally starting to patter against the tin roof high above. I slowly exhaled, believing, just for a fragile moment, that I had lost it. I raised my flashlight and clicked it on to scan my surroundings. The beam cut through the dusty air, illuminating rusted conveyor belts in a massive, cavernous room. But my relief vanished instantly, replaced by a cold dread that froze my blood in the veins. The beam settled on the far wall, where a massive set of loading doors had been heavily chained shut from the inside. And sitting in a perfect semicircle around a fresh, smoking fire pit in the center of the concrete floor were 3 more featureless, pale masks, slowly turning to look directly at me. The sheer mathematical impossibility of survival crashed down on me in that dusty, cavernous room. I thought I was being hunted by a lone, deranged psychopath. I was wrong. I had just locked myself inside their hive. The 3 figures sitting around the smoking fire pit didn't scramble in surprise, and they didn't roar. They just slowly, in perfect, terrifying unison, stood up. The dim orange light cast long, dancing shadows against the corrugated metal walls, making their limbs look impossibly stretched and broken. Now that I was closer, the horrific reality of their appearance snapped into focus. They weren't supernatural monsters. They were feral, breathing people. And those pale, featureless masks weren't made of plastic or fabric. They were crude, thick hides, animal skin, maybe deer or pig, stretched tight and stitched together with dark, thick wire. There were no eye holes, just sheer, blind, stretched leather, yet they stared directly at me. They wore a sickening patchwork of rotting clothes, likely scavenged from the owners of those driver's licenses I'd found buried in the woods. The figure on the left clutched a rusted length of jagged rebar. The one in the middle held a heavy, heavily stained mining pick. Bang! The heavy metal door behind me shuddered violently. Dust rained down from the doorframe onto my shoulders. The one outside was trying to get in. I was completely trapped between the hammer and the anvil. The 3 inside began to advance, separating slowly to cut off any angles of escape on the ground floor. They moved with that same disturbing, dragging gait I had heard outside, their heads tilted sideways like curious, rabid dogs. Panic threatened to completely blind me, but survival instinct took the wheel. The facility was massive, essentially an indoor graveyard of 1920s industrial equipment. About 30 feet to my left, a rusted iron staircase led up to a dizzying network of catwalks and elevated conveyor belts that crisscrossed the high ceiling. It was my only way out of the immediate meat grinder. I gripped my heavy metal flashlight, wound up, and hurled it with everything I had straight at the face of the closest figure. It connected with a wet, sickening thwack, shattering the lens and plunging the massive room into deep darkness, lit only by the dying, glowing embers of the fire pit. The The struck figure let out a wet, gargling screech and stumbled backward into the dirt. I didn't hesitate. I bolted for the stairs. The iron steps screamed under my boots, thick flakes of rust raining down onto the concrete as I scrambled upward. I could hear them charging behind me, a stampede of dragging, heavy footsteps. Pale, filthy hands grabbed at the air mere inches from my ankles as I practically climbed the steps on all fours, completely blind and operating purely on adrenaline. I reached the first elevated catwalk, my hands slipping on decades of black grease and grime, and dragged myself over the metal grating. Below me, the rusted metal door at the entrance finally gave way with a deafening screech, slamming wide open against the concrete wall. Now there were 4 of them. I lay flat against the cold metal grating of the catwalk, 30 feet in the air, pressing my hands over my mouth to muffle my violent, ragged panting. Through the grid of the floor, the dim orange firelight illuminated the concrete below. They gathered in the center of the room. They weren't speaking words, they were communicating in wet clicking noises and those awful suppressed giggles. Then the largest one, the one that had chased me through the woods, slowly raised its arm and pointed a long, filthy finger straight up at the catwalk where I was hiding. They started coming up, but they didn't use the stairs. They scaled the rusted vertical steel support beams of the facility like massive insects, their joints popping and cracking loudly in the dark as they hoisted themselves upward with unnatural strength. I had to move. I crawled backward along the grating on my stomach, desperate to find a ladder or a roof hatch, until my hand bumped into something soft resting on the walkway. I felt it blindly in the dark. It was a heavy canvas jacket, and resting right next to it was a square, hard plastic object with an antenna, a walkie-talkie. I grabbed it, my thumb accidentally grazing the top dial. Instantly, a deafening burst of white static hissed out of the speaker, echoing like a gunshot through the massive, cavernous room, giving away my exact position in the dark.
I fumbled blindly in the dark, my thumb frantically smashing down on the dial to kill the power. The deafening white noise snapped off, leaving a ringing silence in my ears that was almost immediately shattered by a chorus of those wet, sputtering giggles from the void below. They knew exactly where I was. I felt the rusted iron grating beneath my chest begin to vibrate. It was a subtle, rhythmic trembling at first, but it quickly grew violent. The massive vertical support beams of the facility groaned in protest under the shifting weight. They were close. I could hear the sickening pop and crack of their joints as they hoisted themselves up the steel pillars like grotesque, oversized spiders. I scrambled to my feet, abandoning stealth entirely. It was a blind, desperate sprint across a rusted, 2-foot-wide catwalk suspended 30 feet above the concrete floor. The darkness was absolute. I kept my right hand trailing along the jagged safety rail, praying the century-old metal wouldn't snap and send me plummeting into the dying embers of the fire pit below. Behind me, I heard the distinct, heavy clang of boots landing on the metal grating. One of them had reached the upper level. The dragging, methodical pace was gone. It was replaced by a terrifying, metallic thundering. The creature was running on 2 legs now, charging across the iron bridge with zero hesitation in the pitch black. I pushed my burning legs as fast as I dared, my breath tearing at my throat like swallowed glass. The air up here in the rafters was stifling, thick with a century of stagnant coal dust that coated the back of my throat. Suddenly, my hand slipped into empty space. The safety rail vanished. I teetered over the edge, my boots slipping on the greasy metal, arms windmilling as I violently threw my weight backward to catch my balance. I dropped hard to my knees, my hands feeling the jagged, torn edge of the grating. The catwalk had partially collapsed. A gap of empty black air separated me from the continuation of the walkway. I couldn't see how wide it was. The thundering footsteps behind me were closing in fast, 20 feet away, maybe less. I could smell it now, that rotting copper stench wafting ahead of it in the stagnant air. I didn't have time to calculate the distance. I just pushed off the edge and leaped. It was a blind jump into the abyss. For a terrifying second, there was nothing but the rush of air. Then my chest violently slammed against the opposite edge of the grating.
The impact knocked the wind out of me in a sickening rush. My legs dangled over empty space, 30 feet of nothingness below me. I gripped the rusted grid with bloody, torn fingers, screaming through my teeth as I hauled my dead weight upward. I dragged my hips over the edge just as a heavy, thudding foot stomped down on the metal exactly where I had been standing a second before. In the gloom, I saw the silhouette of that featureless, pale mask peering over the gap. It let out a frustrated, guttural grunt. It wouldn't make the jump. I scrambled backward, crab-walking until my back hit a solid wall. I felt around frantically. It was a small, enclosed space, a suspended foreman's control booth. The floor here was solid, rotting wood. I found the heavy iron door frame, pulled myself inside, and slammed the heavy metal door shut, throwing the rusted iron latch just as a massive weight slammed against the outside wall. I collapsed into the corner of the pitch-black booth, trembling so violently my teeth chattered. I was trapped in a box in the sky. The banging outside stopped, replaced by the sound of scratching, long, jagged nails dragging down the corrugated metal siding. Then, the claustrophobic terror of the booth was broken by something entirely different. It was a sound that made the blood in my veins run ice cold. It wasn't coming from outside the door. It was coming from the walkie-talkie still clutched in a death grip in my left hand. The dial was completely turned off, but the speaker hissed to life anyway. And through the crackling white noise, a panicked, breathless human voice whispered, "Are you in the control room?" I stared at the heavy plastic brick in my hand, my mind completely short-circuiting. The power dial was clicked firmly to the off position, yet the green indicator light was pulsing faintly in the pitch-black booth, and that breathless, terrified voice was waiting for an answer. I brought the radio up to my mouth, my thumb trembling so violently I could barely press the transmit button. I kept my voice to the barest, barely audible whisper. "Yes," I breathed, my eyes darting frantically toward the heavy iron door as the scratching outside continued. "I'm in the booth. Who is this?" A burst of static hissed, followed by a wet, shuddering inhale. "My name is David. I was out here a week ago. They took my friend. I've been hiding in the sub-level coal chutes." The voice cracked, thick with exhaustion and raw terror. "Listen to me. You have to get out of that box right now." "Are you insane?" I whispered back, pressing my back harder into the corner of the small room. The smell of decades-old dust and rusted iron was suffocating. "There's one of those freaks right outside the door. If I open it, I'm dead." "You don't understand," David pleaded through the crackling speaker. "I can see the facility from the ventilation shaft. There's not just one outside your door. The others, they didn't stay on the ground floor. They climbed the pillars." My blood ran completely cold. I stopped breathing, straining my ears past the sound of the scratching at the door. The scratching, it wasn't just coming from the corrugated metal anymore. It was coming from beneath me. "They're smart," David's voice hissed through the radio, a frantic edge of panic bleeding into his words. "They know the doors in the foreman booths are reinforced iron, but the floors are just cheap pine. They rot. They're going under you." As if on cue, the solid wood beneath my boots groaned. A heavy, rhythmic thud vibrated up through the soles of my shoes. It wasn't a footstep. It was the blunt force of something heavy and metallic striking the underside of the floorboards. Thwack! The entire booth shuddered. Dust rained down from the low metal ceiling, coating my hair and sticking to the cold sweat on my face. I scrambled backward, pushing myself up into a crouch, frantically trying to distribute my weight. I couldn't see anything in the suffocating darkness, but I could feel the floor bowing upward with every strike. Thwack! A sharp, splintering crack echoed in the confined space. The floorboard, dead center in the room, buckled. They were using the rusted mining pick I'd seen downstairs. They were trying to drop the floor out from under me, sending me plunging 30 feet down into the rusted machinery below. "David," I whispered frantically into the radio, my voice hitching. "David, what do I do? How do I get out?" There's an emergency maintenance hatch on the roof of that booth. It leads to the exterior ore conveyor belt. If you can get onto the roof, you can slide down the belt outside the building. But you have to move now. I shoved the walkie-talkie deep into my jacket and reached my hands blindly toward the ceiling. The ceiling was low, barely 6 feet high. My fingers brushed against the freezing corrugated tin, frantically searching for a latch, a handle, anything. Crash! A deafening explosion of splintering wood erupted directly beneath me. I threw myself against the iron door just as the massive rusted pickaxe violently pierced through the floorboards, missing my ankle by inches. But the pickaxe didn't pull back down. Instead, the hole widened with a sickening crunch as a long, pale, mud-caked arm shoved its way up through the splintered wood, its jagged, filthy fingers blindly grasping at the empty air inside the pitch-black black booth. And that breathless, terrified voice was waiting for an answer. And then, from the walkie-talkie muffled in my pocket, David's voice came through one last time, completely devoid of its previous panic. It was dead, flat, and chillingly calm. "Got you." The chilling realization hit me like a physical blow. David wasn't a survivor. These things didn't just hoard driver's licenses and hiking boots, they hoarded voices. Whether it was a recording on a stolen device or something much, much worse, flawlessly mimicking a victim's final desperate pleas, I had been played, lured into a perfectly designed kill box in the sky. The filthy, pale arm thrashing through the splintered floorboards snapped me out of my shock. Jagged, dirt-caked nails raked blindly across my shin, tearing through my heavy denim jeans and drawing a hot, stinging line of blood. I kicked out violently with my hiking boot, the solid toe connecting with a sickening crunch against its wrist. A wet, muffled shriek echoed from beneath the floor, but a second arm instantly shot up through the widening hole, its fingers wrapped like an iron vise around my ankle. The grip was impossibly strong, yanking me forward so violently my chin slammed against the rotting wood of the floor. I screamed, thrashing wildly in the pitch-black booth. The floor beneath me was groaning, bowing downward as more of them threw their weight against the underside. I scrambled onto my back, driving my free heel directly down into the center of the featureless skin mask I could faintly see pressing up through the shattered gap. Something beneath the stretched leather gave way with a wet snap, and the hand around my ankle released just long enough for me to yank my leg free. David might have been a trap, but I knew 1920s industrial architecture. Foreman booths almost always had roof access for maintaining the upper hoist mechanisms. I scrambled up the wall, my bloody fingers frantically tracing the corrugated tin ceiling in the dark until they caught the rusted lip of a recessed square panel. I shoved upward with every ounce of adrenaline left in my exhausted body. The rusted hinges screamed, snapping off completely as the heavy metal hatch gave way. A blast of freezing, torrential rain and deafening thunder instantly flooded the suffocating, dusty booth. I pulled myself up through the opening, scraping my ribs raw against the jagged metal lip, and rolled out onto the sloped, slippery tin roof of the sorting facility. The storm had fully broken. Lightning flashed in jagged forks across the bruised sky, briefly illuminating the nightmare around me. The facility roof was a perilous, slick death trap of decaying metal, but directly to my right, jutting out from the side of the building and angling sharply down into the black abyss of the forest below, was the exterior ore conveyor belt. It was a massive, semi-enclosed steel chute meant to dump raw rock into train cars at the bottom of the valley. Behind me, the open roof hatch violently rattled. A pale, mud-caked hand slapped onto the wet tin, its long fingers gripping the edge of the opening. The creature was pulling itself up onto the roof. I didn't think. I couldn't. I scrambled on my hands and knees across the slick roof, threw my legs over the rusted iron lip of the conveyor chute, and let go. I hit the decaying rubber belt hard, instantly accelerating down the steep, enclosed tunnel. It was like riding a water slide in hell.
The rusted metal walls of the chute whipped past me in total darkness. Heavy rainwater poured down the tunnel alongside me, turning the century-old rubber into a frictionless slip and slide. I was plummeting at a terrifying speed, completely out of control, careening blindly toward the forest floor. But as I hurtled downward through the pitch-black chute, desperately praying the century-old structure wouldn't collapse under my momentum, a horrific sound pierced through the roar of the rain and the rushing water. It was the distinct, heavy sound of boots heavily squeaking against wet rubber, and it was coming from directly below me inside the chute. Something was crawling up the belt in the dark to meet me.
There was absolutely nothing I could do to stop my momentum. The rusted metal walls of the chute were slick with a century of moss and a fresh torrent of rainwater. I dug my heels into the decaying rubber belt, scraping my palms raw against the sides, but it was useless. I was a human bowling ball hurtling blindly into the pitch-black throat of the tunnel. And the squeaking, rhythmic slap, slap, slap of wet boots coming up the chute was getting deafeningly loud. I pulled my knees to my chest, threw my arms over my face, and braced for the impact. My heart wasn't just pounding, it was a continuous, vibrating hum of absolute terror. I counted the seconds in the dark. 1, 2, 3. A brilliant, jagged flash of lightning briefly illuminated the inside of the chute through a rusted-out hole in the metal ceiling above me. In that split second of harsh, strobe-like white light, I saw it. Less than 10 feet below me, crawling up the steep incline on all fours like a massive, deformed insect, was another one of them. Its tattered clothes were soaked and clinging to its emaciated, unnaturally long limbs. The featureless animal skin mask was completely saturated, sagging heavily against whatever grotesque face lay underneath. It saw me. It didn't try to dodge. It actually raised its arms, its filthy, jagged nails splayed wide in the dark to catch me. The blackness slammed back down, and a fraction of a second later, we collided. The impact was a sickening tangle of limbs, wet clothing, and violent, blunt force. It was like hitting a wall of solid muscle and sharp angles. I slammed my heavy hiking boots squarely into what felt like a rib cage, but its long arms immediately wrapped around my calves like steel cables. It let out that same wet, gurgling shriek, its hot, foul breath, smelling of copper and raw sewage, blasting against my face in the confined, suffocating space. We were locked together, tumbling uncontrollably down the remaining length of the chute. The creature's weight was incredible, trying to crush my legs and drag itself up my body to reach my throat. I punched blindly in the dark, my knuckles connecting with the wet, tough leather of its mask. It didn't even flinch. I felt its jagged nails tear through my wet jeans, biting deep into the flesh of my left calf. I screamed, kicking out wildly with my free leg, driving my heel into where its throat should be. I felt something soft crunch under my boot, and its grip on my legs instantly loosened. Before it could recover, the tunnel vanished. The chute abruptly ended, launching us both out into the freezing torrential downpour. We fell through empty air for a terrifying second before crashing violently into a massive pile of wet, rotting timber and rusted metal debris. Pain exploded through my left shoulder and ribs as I hit the ground. The wind was completely knocked out of me, leaving me gasping like a dying fish in the mud. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the ruins of the lower valley. We had been dumped into the remnants of an old rail yard at the bottom of the sorting facility. About 15 feet away, the creature lay sprawled in the mud, its limbs twisted at unnatural angles among the debris. The thick leather mask had partially ripped during the fall, exposing a patch of pale, deeply scarred skin and a single, unblinking, milky white eye that stared wildly into the storm. It wasn't dead. Slowly, with a sickening series of pops and cracks, it began to untangle itself. It dragged its broken body upward, its gaze locked onto me, letting out a low, ragged hiss. And then, from the top of the dark facility looming high above us, 3 distinct piercing whistles cut through the roaring thunder. The others were coming down.
I didn't wait to see how fast it could recover. As the creature dragged its broken, disjointed body upright in the mud, its single milky eye locked onto me with a look of pure, feral hatred. From high above, the screeching of rusted metal echoed down the side of the facility,
The others were rapidly descending the chute. I had seconds. I forced myself onto my hands and knees, every nerve in my body screaming in protest. My left arm hung uselessly at my side, dislocated or broken from the fall, but the adrenaline flooding my system muted the agony to a dull, throbbing roar. My right hand frantically swept through the wet debris until my fingers wrapped around a heavy, rusted iron rail spike. The creature lunged. It didn't run, it propelled itself forward like a coiled spring, its jaws snapping wildly at the air. I swung the iron spike with everything I had left, driving the blunt, heavy end squarely into the side of its skull. The impact was a sickening, hollow thwack. The creature collapsed into the flooded mud without a sound, its limbs twitching violently. I didn't stop to check if it was dead. I turned and plunged blindly into the torrential blackness of the forest. The next 14 miles were a fractured, hallucinatory nightmare. The severe storm that had trapped me in Oakhaven ultimately became my salvation. The deafening thunder masked the sound of my frantic, crashing footsteps, and the driving rain washed away my scent and the blood dripping from my torn calf. I stumbled through the briars and the deep, freezing mud, guided only by the jagged flashes of lightning that ripped through the canopy. I fell constantly. I hallucinated pale, featureless faces in the bark of every dead tree. I kept hearing that wet, sputtering giggle in the rush of the flooded creeks. Dawn was breaking, casting a bruised, gray light over the mountains, when I finally burst through the tree line and collapsed onto the gravel of the trailhead. My SUV was sitting exactly where I had left it. It felt alien to look at, a pristine piece of the modern world completely untouched by the primordial hell I had just crawled out of. I practically dragged myself to the driver's side door, my bloody fingers fumbling with my keys. I threw myself inside, locked the doors, and collapsed against the steering wheel, sobbing uncontrollably as the engine roared to life. I drove for 3 hours before I found a gas station with a payphone and called the police. They searched the woods for a week. They found the logging road. They found the massive barricade of dead pines, complete with the rusted razor wire. But they didn't find Oakhaven. The trails beyond the barricade were too dense, too flooded from the storm, and eventually the search was called off. They told me I had likely suffered a severe panic attack and a bad fall, hallucinating the rest due to exposure and shock. I know what I saw. I know what chased me. I haven't been near a forest since. I live in a high-rise apartment in the center of the city, surrounded by concrete and streetlights and millions of people. I keep my doors deadbolted. I never hike. I never explore. But the terror didn't stay in those mountains. Every night when I lie in the dark trying to force myself to sleep, I remember the Polaroid they left on that barricade. They had been at my car. They had watched me sleep. And 2 nights ago, just as I was drifting off, my cell phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a blocked number. When I answered, there was no breathing, just the faint crackling sound of white noise. And then a terrified, breathless voice whispered, "My name is David. I was out here a week ago."